Hello, everyone. I'm Ivo Daalder, president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and this is World Review, our weekly look at news from around the world. A lot of things to talk about. We're going to start with the visits of two Asian leaders to the White House, the South Korean president and the president of the Philippines. Then we'll take a look at whether or not there will, in fact, be a counteroffensive in Ukraine. And finally, Turkey is having an incredibly important election in a week's time, and we'll talk about what we can expect and what will happen. Here to talk about all of these issues today are Prashant Rao, who is a senior editor at Semaphore. Prashant, great to have you back.
Thanks for having me. Also
with us, Nahal Toosi, senior foreign affairs correspondent at Politico. Nahal, great to see you.
Great to be here.
And Bobby Ghosh, contributor and editor at Bloomberg Opinion. Bobby, great to have you back here as well.
Hey, good to be back.
Prashant, let's start with you. Aside from the fact that we found out that President Yoon has a wonderful voice when it comes to singing Don McLean's American Pie, can we all sing that? Bye, bye. Anyway, aside from we don't want to do this because he has the wonderful voice. Aside from that, really important visits by two senior Asian leaders, part of this larger attempt by the Biden administration to strengthen alliances in the Indo-Pacific, indeed around the world, but really in the Indo-Pacific to focus on competition with China. So tell us a little bit about what happened in these visits and why they seem to have been, at least from the U.S. perspective, very, very successful.
So I think there are two ways we should look at these visits, the separate visits. One is the way in which I think Southeast Asian and Asian leaders ask, U.S. and Western foreign policy analysts to look at them, which is on their own terms, bilateral engagements. South Korea, with its president, came over to Washington, secured the Washington Declaration. So fairly substantial expansion of American nuclear commitment to South Korea, though not to the extent that perhaps some had expected, and yet it's still a significant expansion. Perhaps the critique is it doesn't deal sufficiently with the actual threat of North Korea's nuclear weapons capabilities, but provides some measure of deterrence. And with the Philippines, increased defense engagement between the United States and the Philippines, and a variety of other deals. The second way to view these two meetings is the way that Southeast Asian and Asian foreign policy analysts explicitly ask us not to, which is through the prism of China, and that everything in Asia is viewed through the U.S.-China foreign policy competition. But I mean, the fact is, this is also, as you said, this is the overarching sort of idea behind the Biden administration's alliance building in. I'm not going to say Indo-Pacific because I really feel like that's the kind of a term that now exists only in the Washington nexus that has frustratingly become populated, but like in Asia, and the sort of overriding sense that the United States is building a series of a network of alliances through the Quad, through bilateral engagements with the Philippines, with South Korea, with Japan, through helping and massaging some prior tensions between the South Korea and Japan, for example, so that it can patch up some old animosities, with the overriding view that it's trying to constrain China's ability to operate in that part of the world. So that's how I sort of view those two. There are, of course, tangible commitments that have been made, and we should view those relationships in the bilateral sense. But the fact is, this is really a story about China.
I think that makes a lot of sense. In some ways, though, Bobby, there's also just on that bilateral piece. Yoon made some very significant progress on South Korean relations with Japan. In fact, the Japanese Prime Minister Kishida will be in South Korea next week. And it's sort of, in some ways, this was a reward, a state visit, it's only second state visit. And of course, President Marcos moved away from the kind of antagonistic policy that his predecessor had towards the United States. So in some ways, you can also see it in that bilateral, not to diminish Prashant's, and just emphasizing Prashant's point. It's really two things, bilaterally as well. And how do you think it was read in those two countries themselves?
I think it's very, very, very significant bilaterally, and you put your finger on it. I think Kishida's visit to Seoul in some ways is even more significant than Yoon's visit to Washington. That both in the bilateral context of Japan and Korea, and in the regional context of East Asia, it's a huge deal. That trip is something that I'll be watching much closer, and not just because there is the likelihood of a karaoke off between the two heads of state, but I think we're going to what emerges from that discussion will be watched very closely in Washington as well. It has enormous consequences for American policy in that part of the world. With the Philippines, 30 years ago, I was a journalist working for an Asian magazine in Hong Kong when the U.S. was forced to leave its military bases in Olongapo and Subic Bay in the Philippines. And I remember what a huge, huge deal. It was the biggest story in that region for weeks and weeks and weeks. And the idea that the U.S. is now getting some basing rights, well, at least right to land and take off military aircraft from the Philippines, just tells you how much the world has turned in that period. It's an old hoary old cliche that in military doctrine that the best aircraft carriers are islands, and Japan and Hawaii are America's best aircraft carriers in the Pacific. Well, if you add the Philippines, that's another really, really important dimension in any kind of security calculus, whether it's to do with China, which of course it is, or more generally with the Pacific.
And Nahal, not only America's footprint militarily is being enhanced by these more recent developments, but America's commitment to the defense of these countries is being enhanced. I mean, you had, of course, the Washington Declaration that Prashant talked about, which sort of reinforces the American nuclear commitment to defending South Korea against nuclear coercion and threat. And in terms of the Philippines, the oldest bilateral defense relationship the United States has with an Asian country, President saying an ironclad commitment to defending the Philippines, which has a territorial dispute, let's not forget, with China in the South China Sea. These are pretty significant statements, because when the president says we will defend you, that usually means that we will, because if we don't, we're in trouble with other allies.
Yeah. So I always find the term ironclad kind of a weird one. As far as I know, and tell me if I'm wrong, but iron rusts, doesn't it? So I've just always found that to be a strange term that we constantly use. Our commitment is ironclad. Okay, whatever. But I just want to point out a couple of things. Look, everything you guys have said makes a lot of sense, but the substance doesn't always necessarily match the rhetoric, right? I mean, according to some critics, like John Bolton argues, for instance, that the Washington Declaration doesn't really amount to much, except that it basically is sort of, accepts that North Korea is going to be a nuclear power. And all it really does is says that, like, nuclear-powered U.S. submarines are going to show up now and then in South Korea, and we're not saying that the South Korean we definitely don't want them to have their own nuclear capacity, but we're not even realistically giving them much more of a say in our decision whether or not to use a nuclear weapon in the event of a conflict. So, I mean, there's a question of how much of that was rhetoric versus reality. And again, one thing to bear in mind with South Korea, as well as the Philippines, as well as the United States, is these commitments can all come and go depending on whoever is in charge, right? These are democracies. And as we've seen in the recent past, like, we can have very widely changing commitments based on whoever is in the White House. And like on the Philippines, I was kind of struck by President Marcos's comments that he made basically afterward. Like, he went out there and publicly said at a CSIS event, I think it was CSIS, that, this is, our bases in our territory are not going to be used for any offensive purposes. And that was basically a signal to China that, like, look, like, I'm dealing with the US, and of course there are allies and all this stuff, but it's not like we're going to, like, be okay if they try to offensively, use our bases against you guys. And that was a strong signal. The agreements with the Philippines also include a lot of economic stuff, which I think was probably more beneficial to President Marcos, or Bongbong as he's known, than a lot of other elements. He also said that publicly, a lot of the new basing agreements and things are about fighting climate change. So it was like he was trying to kind of downplay the military element of a military agreement. So it's important to remember that these guys are also still balancing their relationship with China. China is the Philippines' #1 trading partner, as they are with the United States. So these things all have to kind of be considered. And if I know correctly, I think President Marcos is still in a partnership with Sara Duterte, the daughter of the previous ruler of the Philippines, and that I'm going to guess is not going to last forever. So his own power in the future is questionable. So those are just some hints of wariness that I would bring up.
Yeah, no, I think that's that makes sense. I would say on the Washington Declaration that for the first time, the United States is going to have active consultations with a non-NATO ally about nuclear weapons policy, which we have never done. We don't do it with the Jap. We do it some in some ways, but it's an informal consultative arrangement, which is designed actually less to deter North Korea and more to reassure South Korea that we will be there so they don't need their own nuclear weapons, which I actually think is a good thing, not to have allies for getting weapons.
Yeah, on a slight tangent, it just reminded me that, of course, this week we heard that NATO was going to set up a liaison office in Tokyo with the Japanese.
Yeah, no. I mean, there's that kind of conversation that's going on. Prashant, I want to go back to you because, reading this from China, if you were sitting in Beijing, remember Xi Jinping already said, what was it, 3 weeks ago, that there's an encirclement and a containment strategy. It's very hard to say that that's not a accurate perception, or at least a perception that is based to some extent in reality, given everything that's being done. Maybe the South Korean declaration is about North Korea, but surely China is also a nuclear power, and you're trying to deal with that. And of course, the Philippines, some of the military exercises that were taking place just before, they may not have been offensive, they may have been defensive, but who are they defending against? Would be the question. So, how do you think the Chinese are looking at this, and what does it do for U.S.-China relations?
Well, I mean, already, Chinese foreign ministry statements have been fairly angry. Though I do think it's always useful to hold a lexicography of Chinese foreign ministry statements, which repeat themselves over time. And, things that are heard in Washington as extremely aggressive have been said 6 months prior. And people have forgotten that. That's not to downplay the aggression. It's more just to say that I think China, to go back to Nahal's point about the disconnect between rhetoric and actual policy and action, this is, I think, one where the United States is on the other side of the coin, where its rhetoric seems to be trying to soften the tensions, but its actions very much do not, and are not perceived to be doing so either. The last couple of times I've come on here, I genuinely believe the October 7th chip declaration is, unless that's softened, I just cannot see, and the perception of the chip declaration and the restrictions on semiconductors is so restrictive and so expansive. And then you combine that with these defense agreements. It's understandable that Marcos wants to downplay them. China-ASEAN trade is, I think, by some measures, the biggest trading partnership in the world. It outstrips U.S.-European Union trade by some measure. I think it's like 10% higher, and is growing at a much, much faster pace. And so countries like the Philippines obviously reasonably want to assure their biggest trading partner, and also a huge military behemoth in their vicinity, with whom, as you rightly say, they have a maritime dispute. That's, nothing to see here. But the fact is, I mean, NATO's opening an office in Japan, as Bobby said. While this the Washington Declaration is pointed somewhat towards North Korea, it's obviously got something to do with China. The Quad continues to be a forum in which the United States seems to invest a lot of its energy. AUKUS, we haven't mentioned AUKUS yet. I mean, there is a emerging network of what are clearly, and Jake Sullivan and Janet Yellen can say otherwise, but it's very obvious that these are military and defense partnerships that are geared towards constraining Chinese power. And again, you can go back to the chip declaration. The underlying thesis behind that is now semiconductors, which are the most important piece of technology in the world, are military dual-use technologies, which effectively is saying that, we want to stop China from holding on to the most important technological advance that humankind has ever made. This is, I think, from the Chinese point of view, you can understand why they would interpret all of the actions, leave aside the rhetoric, coming out of Washington as quite aggressive.
Yeah, no, I think that's certainly, and if you're already disposed to having that point of view, you're going to be looking for that, and that's the danger, where the spiral and the danger of the action-reaction phenomenon really sets in, because the Chinese will do something as, see, that's why we need to do this, and you're off to the races. We've been there before. Unfortunately, it looks like we may be there as well. Nahal, let's switch to a place where the action reaction is happening on a day-to-day basis, and it's being done in thousands of artillery and bombs and shells and bombs and missiles and drone attacks, including 2 drones apparently flying over the Kremlin just the other day. The war in Ukraine. It is May. The ground in Ukraine is going to start to harden, and everyone is expecting the Ukrainians to launch a counteroffensive. I must say, I was in Kyiv last week for visits, talking to senior government officials, and the counteroffensive is sort of not something they want to talk about. Very understandable, but it's also not apparent. It's a city that is alive and well, in which there are cranes all over the place, building, not just repairing, but actually doing new buildings. It's a very vibrant city, even though sometimes it gets attacked by missiles, including the night that we were there. But Washington is particularly focused on the counteroffensive. It's the thing that seems to drive it, and there's this hope that somehow this will change things in a way that will end the war. How do what does your reporting tell you about what the expectation is in Washington, and how should we think about this?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm glad you're safe, Ivo, and Kyiv is amazing, one of the most amazing cities I've ever seen myself. Look, on the counteroffensive, I am told by U.S. officials, other officials, no one except maybe a handful of people know the timing of this official start of the timing, not yet. And even those people who really should know may not have decided yet. Now that said, part of me kind of wonders, is this kind of like a restaurant? Like, is there like a soft launch and then a hard launch? Like what exactly is, are they going to say, oh, it began last week? Didn't you see that thing we did here? It's, what defines the start of a counteroffensive? I'm not 100% certain. And I think there's probably reasons people don't want to have too hard of a definition for that. But European sources have told me, some of them, that they think the earliest would be the end of this month, the end of May. Some people are saying it might even be a summer offensive. The mud, this is one of the funniest things. An administration source and I were talking about how in the 21st century, we still have not figured out a solution for the mud right now, which really it really is a problem. And I am told that, you cannot just put out a bunch of coats and roll over the mud that way. So these are all of the things they are considering. Now, these drone strikes on the Kremlin, I do not know what the origin was. My initial reaction was, this could be a false flag thing. It seemed to me like kind of a dumb way to try to assassinate somebody, or even to try to damage the Kremlin. But it also kind of raised questions about Russia's own air defenses. So I found it all kind of strange. But we also do know that there are these pro-Ukrainian groups out there that are not necessarily directly affiliated with the Ukrainian government. And so this could be something that is undertaken by them. In recent days, the Russians have been using their media and other outlets to try to kind of prepare their population for what they are saying could be a very strong Ukrainian counteroffensive. But that's partly because they want to prepare Russians either for an amazing Russian victory or like an explainable Russian loss. Now, in terms of the American reaction and desires for this, Look, there is a lot of expectation, hopes that the Ukrainians will regain a significant amount of territory to the point where it could dampen any growing opposition among Republicans and others to continuing to help Ukraine. But I honestly do not know how much of this is like projection by the U.S. onto the Ukrainians about what this counteroffensive can accomplish, and how much of it is the Ukrainians saying, oh, no, this is going to be amazing. This is going to be fantastic. Because let's not forget that the Russians carry out an offensive and people thought that was going to be a fairly big deal. And it turned out to not be very much. In fact, some of the recent news is that the Wagner forces chief, Evgeny Prigozhin, has put out this crazy video and statement today pointing to dead bodies and yelling at the Russian military, saying, why are you not giving my mercenary forces more ammunition? We're dying, and we're going to leave Bakhmut, which is one of the key cities that's being fought over, by May 10th. So there's a lot going on. And at the end of the day, I will ask everyone to remember that Ukraine has surprised us in the past repeatedly, over and over again. Our own U.S. military intelligence on them did not seem to be particularly good. And that includes their last offensive, where they kind of did a head fake and regained a massive amount of territory in a region that people did not expect. So I think anything is possible. And I know that's not a very satisfying answer or analysis. But I think given everything that's out there, for all we know, we might be told in a few days, oh, it began, 5 days ago. And where were you? So.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good analysis, Nahal, of the complexities that is out there, because it is very complex, and war is extremely dynamic. I think your point on the Russian offensive, which was very big, but they lost, according to I guess John Kirby the other day, 100,000 Russians casualties, including 20,000 killed, which is a 1-to-5 ratio, which is like Vietnam. Ratios. They're not taking care of their wounded either. That's the other sort of way to think about this. But it's a massive amount of people. We're now talking 250 to 300,000 casualties in the war on the Russian side, which must have an impact on Russia and give Ukrainians some hope that perhaps that their ability to move forward against the Russians is high. But Bobby, one of the interesting things that I heard in Kyiv was, you're all looking at this counteroffensive as a one and done, and we are looking at the counteroffensive as the first punch of a number of other punches that we need to land, because our goal isn't just to move the front line. Our goal is to reacquire all the territory that we've lost since 2014, and go back to our borders. And is there a possibility that there's a real disconnect emerging between how the Western supporters of Ukraine, including the United States and our allies in Europe, are expecting, and what the Ukrainians are in fact thinking about?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting way of putting it. It reminds me of when back in high school I used to box. When you're up against a heavier weight class than yourself, the thing to do is not, you can't punch hard. You have to punch often. And in quick succession, a flurry of punches rather than one haymaker is how you fight a heavier opponent, and that's what Ukraine faces. And I think the perspective on the American side is sometimes skewed by the fact that we too are a heavyweight, and we think the other heavyweight can be knocked out with a single blow. But we forget that the one who is actually doing the fighting in the ring is not a heavyweight and has to have different strategy. I think the ground realities, and that's to be taken literally, as Nahal said, it's about mud and hardening mud. The ground realities are the same for both sides. Russia can no more operate its tanks or can no more move in this mud than the Ukrainians can. But Russia does have, at the moment, superiority in the air, both in terms of missiles and in terms of aircraft. It does not need the ground to harden in order to inflict quite a lot of damage. The date I'm watching is May 9th, next week, which is Victory Day in Russia. I suspect Putin will feel under some pressure to make some sort of, at the very least, some sort of a gesture. If you saw those video clips of the quadcopters that landed on the roof of one part of the Kremlin. In the foreground, you see big signs commemorating Victory Day, which means that the Kremlin wants to put on some kind of a show. It's practically obliged to put on some kind of a show. It will recognize that no matter how many tanks or missiles it rolls down the Red Square, the question in the heads of most Russians will be what's going on in Ukraine. Russians will also have seen those videos, again, that Nahal was pointing out, of the Wagner chief screaming blue murder at Putin's generals. So some kind of a gesture seems almost inevitable from Putin. And
when you say gesture, Bobby, what are you thinking about in terms of military escalation or diplomatic engagement?
I think it would have to be some form of military escalation, and given the limitations of of the weather and ground conditions, I assume it would have to come from the air. Maybe a bigger barrage than we've seen of rockets. I hope not, but I would be very surprised if Putin didn't try something. Now, in much of this war, every time he's tried something, he's failed, and let's hope that continues to be the case.
Yeah, I mean, I think that would strengthen the case for the argument that the drones over the Kremlin were a false flag operation. It seems they are pretty darn aggressive in terms of the way they came out to talk about it. But yeah, who knows? Because the real answer is apparently only the people who did it know. No one else seems to. In some ways, Prashant, in your conversation in London, more generally. Is there a worry that there is that we're running out of steam in our ability both our ability and willingness to help the Ukrainians, and if they have a rope-a-dope strategy or many punches against the higher, the heavier weight, as Bobby put it, that in fact there is this disconnect between the expectation of what we're willing and able to do and what the Ukrainians are expecting us to do, and how should we think about that? Is that a higher problem in London or indeed in European capitals? How do you look at it?
Yeah, I think one thing that's sort of important to say in all this is, while this is obviously an essential war for Europe, it is the United States that is the essential partner to Ukraine, and everything that Europe is doing, to however you characterize it as commendable, it pales in comparison to the aid and military support that the United States has been providing to Ukraine. And so, while the European effort to increase ammunition manufacturing and all these things is interesting, it's not the thing that moves the needle. It's really the United States, it has been the sort of essential partner. And so any movement within the United States, however small, however sort of seemingly intangible, is I think really sort of studied quite deeply on the side of the Atlantic, because it has such an outsized impact on this war in a way that similar movements in Berlin or Paris just don't. There's just not the same tangible impact in terms of the aid and support that comes through. I think the other thing, following on from Bobby's boxing metaphors, one of the things that has been interesting about the Ukrainians is how much their sort of military sort of structure has adapted to this war in really kind of remarkable ways. The sort of head fake that Nahal talked about was also indicative of how interestingly they empower their sort of local commanders to make very quick decisions in a way that the Russian military, so far at least, has not shown an ability to, and has not shown the learnings yet to allow its commanders to make basic tactical decisions without the approval from on high. And that, what if and when this counteroffensive finally gets going, it'll be interesting to watch how much that plays into it as well. And the Ukrainians, when they have been able to, have shown a sort of remarkable degree of tactical adaptability that I don't think anybody fully understood before this war began. And I'm not sure we still have fully internalized how different these two militaries are, and just a sort of raw like-for-like comparison in terms of their capabilities, I think underplays the softer skills that the Ukrainian armed forces and the Ukrainian sort of society at large seem to have in ways that currently the Russian armed forces do not.
I think it's a really important point. It's and how I think it was Chairman Milley, General Milley, who said this is a war between a large Soviet army and a small Soviet army. In some ways, that's kind of true because that's where they were trained. But they have evolved, the Ukrainians, in a way that the Russians have not. I mean, the latest offensive is this classic Russian offensive, throw as much as you can against and destroy the city. We've seen it in Chechnya. Frankly, we've seen it in World War II. This is how they fight. But that's not how the Ukrainians have been fighting, and they've certainly not been trained that way in the last 4 or 5 months by the U.S. and other NATO allies to launch this counteroffensive.
And also what they've learned since 2014. I mean, people often forget this war is actually wow, 9 years old. I had my math moment there for a second. But look, I also, again, I cannot stress enough how often I have been surprised and disappointed, I guess, in our U.S. military's assessments of the Ukrainian and Russian forces. So I just take everything with a grain of salt, including, what we get from U.S. officials, top U.S. officials about what they think the Ukrainians will or won't do. I just always try to reserve judgment. One thing I just do want to point out, though, is, what we just saw, this alleged, assassination attempt or whatever on Putin or the Kremlin, whatever it was. One of the things that I am increasingly kind of intrigued by is Volodymyr Zelensky's own personal security. I mean, it seems like every day he's getting visits from, actors and all these people. I mean, sure, the Bahraini foreign minister was just there, but Sean Penn shows up, or other people, and you just kind of wonder about his own personal security, and whether that is something that they should be a little more concerned about. The question is, what are some game changers in this? What could the Russians do? We think to ourselves, oh, well, more missiles in the sky. Sure, that's possible. Or they could try to take a hit out on a serious hit out on the Ukrainian president. And that would be certainly a game changer. And it's kind of, it's scary to think about, but I think it's something we have to ask, especially because it's hard for me to understand how they don't know where he is, or the Russians can't penetrate his fortress, given what seems to be like a lot of access. They
lose the whole of the global south the moment they do that.
No, but it's a great point, because the Berlin police also just put out a statement yesterday saying that they were investigating a possible leak in the German media that was attributed to the Berlin police force. This is certainly something that is a live risk, that whether or not they lose the global south, I think it's the tactical advantage that would be gained would be so enormous. And clearly it's something they're at. I mean, the fact that the German police are actively investigating now that there might have been a leak from their own about a potential Zelensky visit.
Yeah, and I would agree that losing the global south, it's bad for a little while, but then they'll get the global south back.
It's more than that. They'd lose the global south, and European reluctance to give the Ukrainians more arms would sort of vanish overnight.
I guess
there's a military dimension as well as a sort of political dimension.
I think though, if we were to sort of play out. If we were to play out this global south hypothetical, though, why would the global south change its mind suddenly, given that already, he's launched a full-scale invasion on this country, tried to assassinate him? That was the clear plan early on, has led to the widespread killing of, and, noted human rights violations, including a sort of warrant from the International Criminal Court. And so while, of course, that would, it would be a huge escalation. I don't mean to downplay it. I just mean, one of the sort of, I think, things that we've learned is it's not that Brazil and India are sort of pro-Russian. I think they are just, valuing their national interests over any sort of particular stance. And I'm not.
I would be more interested in Xi Jinping. I don't know if Xi Jinping would go along with the decapitation strategy. That's the one opinion that matters the most, I think, to Moscow.
I would also, I'm not 100% convinced that it will have the negative strategic impact on the Ukrainian capacity to conduct the war. Zelensky has been incredibly effective as a communicator. I mean, a true, almost Churchillian leader, and he's been incredibly sharp about how he talks to different audiences in ways. But in the end, he's the commander-in-chief, and you can have other commander-in-chiefs who can do that just as well. He's not guiding the war day to day. He's not He's just a very effective leader and communicator. If he had been assassinated at the outset of the war, which clearly I think Prashant was the goal here, that would have had an impact, because you wouldn't have had the positive impact that he's had since then. But you've now had that, and you have a country that is so united, and so. I mean, I heard more people say I hate Russians in 2 days in Kyiv than I have ever heard in my entire life. And it is genuine, it's real, and it's understandable given what's going on. So I'm not sure that is the sort of the linchpin. I also, the whole idea that one tries to assassinate Vladimir Putin by sending a drone over to Kremlin just strikes me as really bad propaganda.
He doesn't live there. He very rarely goes there.
It just is completely. It's so far removed from reality that. But we got to move on, because I don't want to. I want to get to the really important election, and certainly the most important election this year, and possibly depending on the outcome, maybe the last election in Turkey for a long year. Bobby, you were there. You went to Istanbul and Ankara. You visited. You did reporting on the ground. There is this sense that this is a make or break kind of election, and just to set it up, because I know you're gonna hit it down, but there's that sense that if Erdogan wins or remains in power, even if he loses, there's no prospect for getting rid of him electorally. And at the other hand, that if Erdogan loses, that Turkey becomes this wonderful, blooming, Western-oriented society. Are we living in false expectations?
I think we are to some degree, and on both those counts. Erdogan has not openly cheated in an election. I mean, he puts his finger on the scale, but has never grabbed an election. The best analog would be a couple of years ago when his party lost Istanbul in the mayoral race, which is a very, very important bellwether in Turkey. They engineered it. The result was very close, and so they engineered it so that there was a runoff election, and then they let the runoff election proceed more or less free and fair, and lost by an even bigger margin. An autocrat who is determined to hold on to power no matter what doesn't really do that. So I'm not sure he would cheat outright. But if the election result is very close, even that little finger he puts on the scale might be important when the time comes. So when I was in Turkey, a lot of people were expecting the presidential election to go to the second round. The expectation was that none of the candidates would get enough in the first round for an outright win. 2 weeks later, there'd be a runoff. And if a runoff happened, the expectation was that Erdogan would lose. Look, at the moment, all the outcomes are possible. He could lose the presidency, his party could lose parliament. He could lose the presidency, his party could retain parliament. He could retain the presidency and his party could lose. All of the permutations and combinations are still on the table. None of them can be ruled out at this stage. I put out a column earlier this week examining the main opposition candidate, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, and looking at his foreign policy postures, because that's what we care about, the rest of the world. And in some areas, his worldview is not that different from Erdogan's. It's important to keep that in mind. In other areas, his ability to make big changes will be constrained by the fact that he is leading a very disparate coalition, which includes some hardline nationalists. So there's some policy U-turns that he's not going to be able to make. And the most important thing is this: if he wins the election, let's assume he does, he earns a bunch of political capital. His domestic problems are so great, particularly to do with the economy, he's going to want to spend all of that capital on the domestic problems. He's not going to want to make any big decisions on foreign policy that will require him to invest some of that political capital internally within Turkey. I think we can see, and he has said this, that if he becomes president, Sweden is admitted into NATO like that. And so when the summit takes place in Vilnius in July, there'll be 32 members rather than 31. And it would be a good way for him to introduce himself to NATO and to the world. So that's, I think, a possible gimme. Beyond that, everything else he will have to do, if he wants to do, very slowly over a period of time. He's not going to change Turkey's posture in Syria. Just like Erdogan, he regards our allies in Syria as a terrorist group, and he's not going to budge on that. The tone with Greece may change. He may not be as aggressive towards the Greeks. I think that's mostly that sort of contretemps we've seen over the past few months has mostly had to do with the fact that both those countries have elections coming up. I think that tone will soften, and I don't need to tell you the importance of tone in international diplomacy. But in actual substance, if we want Kılıçdaroğlu, assuming he wins, if we want him to make big changes, the West is going to have to show a lot of patience and is going to have to help him solve those domestic problems so that he can save some capital for international ones.
And it strikes me, Bobby, a really excellent overview. I think it's very important that people pay close attention to this election because it does matter. And sometimes elections don't matter. This one does. It does strike me that if the expectation also is, and Nahal, jump in here, on that sanctions all of a sudden will be imposed on Russia, and that the relationship with Russia is going to become as antagonistic as the other NATO members' relationship with Russia, with the exception of Hungary. That probably is not going to happen either. And my sense is it would be a good idea for the United States not to make that point one in the relationship, because actually having someone who talks to the Russians is not a bad idea. But the other is the domestic political environment that Bobby talked about will make it necessary to move slowly on that. Do you see there's a possibility of that nuance in Washington when it comes to thinking about a post-Erdogan Turkey?
I think that the people in Washington who handle Turkey are very aware of its interests and its actions, and how they don't always seem to align with what we want, even though they are a fellow NATO member. And I think that's something that the president on down has known for a long time. And I never get the expectation that they think it's just an Erdogan thing. I think they think it's a Turkey thing, and that's probably the type of, they're going to try to play every side, no matter who's in charge. And look, I think Bobby did a really nice job of saying like everything. I'll just make 2 points. The domestic problems include, literally the prices of food and inflation and things like that. These are very serious. And so I definitely agree that, whoever wins is going to need to focus on that for domestic considerations. The other thing I will say is, look, there's this new show out on Netflix called The Diplomat. Okay. And okay, seriously, and you just hear me out. And there's going to be a slight spoiler alert, but don't worry, it's not too big in what I just say. Okay, one of the ways that Turkey is like one of the most confusing things in U.S. foreign policy, and that most Americans just don't really understand what it believes or where it stands, because of Erdogan, but others as well, is in this show, which is about U.S. diplomacy. Okay, you have U.S. diplomats saying Iran is an ally of Turkey. Okay? And that's how they decide. They try to get a message to Iran by something they say about Turkey and its allies. Okay. And nowhere is it mentioned that Turkey is actually a member of NATO, and that the Iranian-Turkish relationship is complicated at best and in no way amounts to an alliance. Okay. So this is a TV show that is the #1 show for Netflix globally right now on TV. And this is how Turkey is portrayed. So that's all.
By the way, I should emphasize that you did a really nice piece in Politico about The Diplomat, and both from a show perspective and a diplomacy perspective. So well done. Well worth reading it, and probably read it after you watch the show, if you decide to watch the show, which of course I have. Prashant, last word to you. You can talk about The Diplomat if you want, but without spoiling anything for us. But more importantly, Turkey and its relationship with Europe, Turkey and its relationship with the Middle East. Turkey is a major strategic, geographically actor, no matter who's in power. So what's the expectation that you're hearing, both in terms of the election, but then is there a lot of false hope being given on a change, false hope in Bobby's terms, or what do you see happening in the circles that you're running around with? And we only have about a minute or so. So complicated subject in 30 seconds.
I actually don't have much to say. I have to say, I thought Bobby's piece was excellent and Nahal's piece was excellent. So I would actually just recommend people read those. That's probably a better use of your time than listening to me waffle on.
Well, I mean, we could end by singing American Pie, right? We could try that.
We need to hear you sing. No, I want to know if your wife is right.
May I suggest another song? Istanbul, not Constantinople.
Oh no!
Because of the very important phrase, it's nobody's business but the Turks.
That's a good point.
We're gonna leave it there. Thank you, and it was also even better, Bobby, that you didn't sing it. So we appreciate that. Our listeners and viewers appreciate it. Really want to thank Bobby Ghosh, Nahal Toosi, Prashant Rao for once again a really terrific conversation. And I want to thank all of you for tuning in. We'll be back next week with another edition of World Review. Until then, have a wonderful weekend.